Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to UBC Psychology's Quinn Memorial Lecture. My name is Jeff Hall, and I am the head of the Department of Psychology. Today's talk is made possible by a generous gift to our department from UBC Psychology alumnus Dr. Michael J. Quinn. Dr. Quinn carried out pioneering research on physiological markers of psychopathology under the supervision of our now emeritus professor Bob Hare. In 1969, Dr. Quinn became the second person to receive a PhD in psychology from UBC. He went on to have a long and distinguished career as a clinical psychologist at Riverview Hospital in Coquitlam. This year marks the 10th anniversary of the Quinn Memorial Lecture, and as many of you know, this is an event that brings together the UBC psychology community and its alumni and friends for conversation and a chance to learn firsthand about some of the most innovative psychological research from internationally renowned experts. This year is also notable because it is the 100th anniversary of the University of British Columbia, and this important milestone will be celebrated throughout the coming months with many special events across campus. And for us here in psychology, today's event is an absolutely fitting kickoff to these celebrations. Susan Carey. Susan Carey is a towering figure in the field of developmental psychology and one of the world's preeminent cognitive scientists. Spanning almost 40 years, her groundbreaking body of work has completely transformed the study of the development of the human mind. Dr. Carey has made seminal contributions across a breathtaking range of research areas, some of which would be unrecognizable today without her influence if they existed at all. She's done pioneering and agenda-setting work in the study of the acquisition of word meaning. She and her colleagues have carried out a fundamentally important series of studies on face perception and recognition. She's conducted landmark work on the foundations of biological thought, research that's now inspired decades of investigations into the implications of her proposals. And she's also done trailblazing empirical and theoretical work on the origins of concepts in infancy. She's a leading proponent of the view that the infant's mind is not initially limited to sensory, perceptual, or sensory motor representations, as claimed by empiricist philosophers like Locke or Berkeley, or psychologists like Piaget, but is instead richly conceptual, equipped with systems of understanding or core cognition that are centered on representations of objects, agents, and number. Her research is renowned for its painstaking efforts to describe precisely not only the infant's initial representational resources, but also the differences between those resources and the ones that appear after infancy as new knowledge systems emerge. She's an influential defender of the view that these developmental changes involve discontinuities or incommensurabilities, contrary to the views of famous continuity theorists like Fodor or Pinker. And she's widely known for her provocative arguments about the mechanisms that underlie the changes and for her innovative exploration of how these changes are related to knowledge restructuring in adults, as well as to shifts in conceptual frameworks in the history of science. Her writings on these and many other topics are unmatched in the field for their theoretical scope and depth, and they've had a profound impact not only on the field of psychology, but also on allied disciplines like philosophy, linguistics, neuroscience, and education. Susan Carey received her BA from Radcliffe and her PhD from Harvard. She was on the faculty at MIT for over 20 years. She spent 5 years at NYU and then moved to Harvard in 2001, where she is now the Henry and Elizabeth Morse Professor of Psychology. Her work has been recognized with many of the field's most prestigious honors. She's a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a fellow of the National Academy of Sciences. She's received a Guggenheim Fellowship, the William James Fellow Award from the Association for Psychological Science, and the Nicot Prize for the Philosophy of Mind. In 2008, she was awarded the Rumelhart Prize for significant contributions to the theoretical foundations of human cognition, the first woman to win this award. In 2009, she received the Distinguished Scientific Contribution Award from the American Psychological Association, and just last year, she received the Mentor Award in Developmental Psychology from the American Psychological Association. We're absolutely delighted to have her here today to speak on concept acquisition beyond logical construction and the building blocks model. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Susan Carey.
So thank you very much. I'm very honored to be here, and I've had a wonderful day because you have a fantastic department. Those of you who are in it know this, and those of you who are guests believe me. It's really, really one of the best departments in North America at the moment. So it's really fun to be here, and as I said, I'm very honored to be asked to do this. Okay, so one pressing challenge for cognitive science is accounting for the human conceptual repertoire. We're the only animal that can think thoughts. Let me just start this. Think thoughts about the causes and cures of global warming, the causes and cures of pancreatic cancer. In fact, there's a potentially infinite number of thoughts that we can think that no other animal can think, but we have very much the same brains as non-human primates. This project of understanding where the human conceptual repertoire comes from is rightly one of the central issues in the history of philosophy and in cognitive science today, and rightly, philosophers and cognitive scientists have concerned themselves with what makes it possible. I'm going to add a second question to the question of what makes it possible, and that is to show you that sometimes it's very, very easy, and sometimes it's very, very hard. And understanding when it's easy because we form a new concept upon seeing a new member of a kind once, or hearing a new word once, one trial learning. In other cases, we study in education domains of knowledge, and after 20 years, we haven't acquired the basic concepts in there. So one question as we think about what makes it possible is we should also think about why is it sometimes hard and why is it sometimes easy, and what does all this tell us about the nature of concepts? Okay, so as a matter of logic, the answer to the question of what makes concept learning possible has to be a characterization of what the innate representational primitives that babies have. Because those are going to be, babies look out in the world and they make sense of it. And those are going to be the way that the concepts and representations in terms of which they make sense of the world are going to be the input into further learning processes. And we have to characterize the adult conceptual repertoire. What is it we're trying to explain? And then we have to ask ourselves, how different are those two? Because that sets the problem for how hard the learning problem is that we have to face. This is not supposed to be controversial. This is just a matter of logic. And as Jeff said, the research program necessarily has to specify the answer to all those questions. And I have argued, as he said, that the innate conceptual repertoire is much richer than some people historically and even today believe. But nonetheless, the initial conceptual repertoire is very, very different from the adult one. So we really do face a hard problem. And the cases where it's hard are cases where the initial state and the learning mechanisms can't do it immediately and easily. And I'm going to give you a feel for why I assert all those claims. But I want to do something else in this lecture, which is that along the way of doing this work, I addressed two challenges to cognitive science from the dominant view within cognitive science of how this works. And these challenges were made very explicit and tellingly by philosopher Jerry Fodor. And I want to lay out what his challenges are, tell you what the dominant view of the picture of cognitive development is, how that dominant view gets you into the problems that Jerry Fodor is raising, and then show you how the true picture resolves these challenges. Okay, so that's what I'm going to try to do today. Okay, so what is the dominant view? The dominant view, and I've just listed Jerry Fodor, Steve Pinker, Ray Jackendoff, George Ray, Josh Tenenbaum, Liz Spelke. You could ... share this view. And the view is this. The adult conceptual repertoire is a function of a set of innate primitives, one, and of the combinatorial processes through which new concepts are composed from these primitives. And the learning mechanisms involve hypothesis formation over those primitives by conceptual combination and confirmation, inductive processes, right? And therefore, 1 and 2, the set of innate primitives and the combinatorial processes through which new concepts are composed from these primitives, determine a space of possible concepts, the potential adult repertoire. Okay, so that's the dominant view in cognitive science. And here's the challenges that this cognitive view this dominant view gets into us. It seems on the face of it that the expressive power, the thoughts we can think of adults, are completely beyond the capacity of an 18-month-old. 18-month-olds can't worry about democracy or global warming or pancreatic cancer. And it seems like not only can't they, but they don't have the subunits of those concepts to construct those concepts out of what they have. So how, if you accept this view, can learning increase the expressive power of a conceptual repertoire? Okay. And the second challenge, which I'm going to just quickly say, is that the classical view, the standard view, with one other assumption, has the consequences that all concepts that are lexicalized as single words in natural languages, like proton, hammer, wisdom, etc., are innate. Okay? And that's an absurd position, right? It's just not the case that quark is an innate concept. So how do we get out of that consequence of this classic view? So let's see how the classic view leads to those two consequences. It's a one-liner that learning cannot increase expressive power. Okay, so expressive power is a function of the innate primitives and what can be constructed from them using the combinatorial machinery in our minds. What is learning? Learning is characterized by a set of innate primitives and the logical resources through which one builds new representations from these primitives. Those are the same thing. So, of course, learning can't increase expressive power. The innate conceptual repertoire logically determines the space of human concepts under those assumptions. Okay, how do we get to radical concept nativism? Well, again, you start out with these premises that all learning is hypothesis confirmation, that new concepts are learned via logical construction from old concepts. Concepts lexicalized, here's the new hypothesis. Concepts lexicalized as single words cannot be analyzed as logical constructions. So this is atomism, and I accept atomism, right? So if you accept atomism, to acquire a new lexicalized concept, one would have to confirm hypotheses already containing it. If you can't build the concept dog out of primitives, then you can only learn the concept dog upon seeing dogs and seeing that, and having the hypothesis, that's a dog, right? Therefore, no monomorphemic, that is lexicalized as a single word concept, can be learned. Okay, those are FODOR'S two challenges that follow from the classical view. And so what's gone wrong in the classical view? Okay, here's what I think what's wrong. You need to make a distinction between computational primitives and innate primitives, okay? And computational primitives are not always innate primitives, all right? So a computational primitive is the smallest constituent of thought. Okay, those are the thoughts we build other thoughts out of. An innate primitive are the constituents of thoughts that do not arise through learning. Okay, that's what innate means. Expressive power is not a function of innate primitives and what can be constructed from them using the combinatorial machinery of the language of thought. Rather, expressive power at any given point in development is a function of the computational primitives that the child has at that moment and what can be constructed from them using the combinatorial machinery of the language of thought. Okay? So if, I'm just going to skip this. The solution is new primitives can be learned. So now what I'm going to try to show you is how new primitives can be learned, okay? And I'm going to give an example from ethology rather than from conceptual learning, because I think it shows very clearly how the existence of learning mechanisms that don't meet the standard view that I've just laid out. Okay, and the example, I could have chosen a million examples, but I'm just choosing a simple one. This is Stephen Emlin's work on indigo bunting navigation. So indigo buntings are this very pretty passerine, and like many animals, they migrate from southern Canada, like many birds, migrate from southern Canada down to Central America for the winter, and then back to Canada for the summer. Now that's a 3,000-mile trip, and the question is, how do they manage this trip? How do they know? How do they know when it's time to fly south, what direction south is? And how do they know when it's time to fly north, what direction north is? Because if they fly 3,000 miles the wrong direction, they end up in the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, and they're dead. Now, it turns out they fly at night. So we can rule out lots of mechanisms. They're not following a map because they can't see the ground. They're not flying by the sun because they can't see the sun. They're following celestial navigation. Now, there's many ways you could use the stars to navigate, but in the interest of time, I won't tell you how we know. They actually identify the North Star, and they set their course by the North Star. So they look up in the sky, they identify the North Star. The North Star is a computational primitive in this system, right? And then they set their course with respect to it. And they adjust, as they're flying, they constantly adjust their flight by checking how it is in relation to the North Star. Now the question is, how on earth do they know which star in the sky is the North Star? Now one possibility is that's innate itself. There's that this computational primitive that they have to be able to identify in order to set their course is innate. But that's unlikely because the Earth tilts. Right now, the North Star is Polaris. 30,000 years ago and 30,000 years from now, it'll be Vega. And if they set their score by their flight by Vega today, they would end up dead out in the water. So they have to learn which star in the sky is the North Star. How do they do this? Well, we know how they do this. The Earth more or less turns on a north-south axis. So if you had a mechanism that allowed you to analyze the center of rotation of the night sky, you could pick out the North Star. And Emlyn showed that that's indeed how they do it, by raising nestlings in a planetarium where he made the sky rotate around any arbitrary star he wanted. And then when their hormones are telling him it's time to fly, he measured what direction they flew off. And they flew off north or south, depending upon what season it was, set to the center of rotation of the night sky that they saw. So there's no doubt that's the learning mechanism by which indigo buntings discover the computational primitive they need for the very, very important computation of determining their direction of flight. Okay, so this example provides a counterexample to all three of the standard premises. All learning is hypothesis confirmation. There's absolutely no hypothesis confirmation in this learning mechanism. They never get any feedback. They compute north, where they compute what part of the sky is north, and then they just live or die by it. They never get any feedback, right? They don't have any chance for hypothesis testing and confirmation. Furthermore, they don't consider any hypotheses. They don't look up there and think, could it be this star, this star, this star, this star, this star? What evidence can I have with respect to those stars? No, this is just a mechanism that is built in to compute this particular innate primitive. It's a learning mechanism for sure. And so there's you can ask the question, what could this mechanism learn? And in fact, that's a very useful thing to do to make sure you've characterized it right. You could ask, what if the stars repeated their local configurations? That would really screw this hypothesis up, because once you've formed that image of what north looks like, if lots of parts of the sky looked like that, you'd be in trouble. If the stars were too close together, this mechanism wouldn't work, et cetera. So you can definitely say, well, what space of possible configurations could this mechanism learn? But it's not a hypothesis space, right? So what this example says is that here's a case of learning an important new computational primitive that just doesn't meet the standard view of what learning looks like. And in fact, all of the easy cases of learning new primitives are cases like this, right? There is an innate conceptual role. So they don't have to learn the concept north. That is, there's the conceptual role of using this to navigate is also innate. But they do have to learn a computational primitive, a really important one. This system needs to know how to identify north in the night sky. So the easy routes are all ones where there's an innate conceptual role and there's innate learning mechanisms that guarantee that you can acquire from what you're going to encounter the computational primitives you need to ensure that conceptual role. And I'm not going to say any more about examples of that for conceptual learning, but there are many, many examples. So in conceptual learning. So for example, we have an innate kind syndrome. It's an innate conceptual role. There are going to be abstract kinds with infinitely number of new members. And new conceptual primitives are acquired when concepts for each new kind is acquired. Before you've ever encountered a kangaroo, you can't think thoughts about kangaroos. And similarly, a dung beetle, a wrench, and all of these other things. But you don't, and so acquiring each one increases expressive powers. And they're not constructed from innate primitives by logical combination, and they're not acquired by enumerative induction, okay? So I could give a whole lecture backing this up. You could talk to Eric Margolis, one of your colleagues here. But the point is, this is an example within conceptual learning that's an easy case like the Indigo Bunting's learning examples. I want to now talk about the hard cases. The hard cases are cases where there are conceptual discontinuities. Here, the problem is learning new computational primitives when there's not already a conceptual role for that representation to fill, and there's not an innate learning mechanism that knows where the input is that's relevant to creating the computational primitive you need to fill that conceptual role. So in these cases, there's co-construction of conceptual roles and new computational primitives, okay? And I'm going to illustrate this with an example of learning natural number. So in the case of natural number, there's two sets of innate primitives with numerical content. Analog magnitude representations and parallel individuation. I want to show you how this works. So one of them is the analog magnitude representation, that's de Haan's number sense, and parallel individuation are parallel representations of small sets of individuals in working memory. And those are the innate ones. The developmentally earliest representations of at least some natural numbers, some integers, are verbal counting. And I want to show you how different verbal counting is from the innate beginning place to illustrate what I mean by a discontinuity. So, what are the two core systems like? The analog magnitude system takes sets of large numbers of individuals and creates an analog representation of that number, a number that, a neural magnitude that is a linear or logarithmic function of the set size. And it's characterized by Weber's law by noise that's a function of the magnitude. The bigger the number, the more noisy the representations get. The other system, parallel individuation, creates mental models that contain one individual for each individual in a set. And this has an absolute set size limit of 3. So totally different limits. That's how you know these are two different systems. So let me show you how the analog magnitude system works. I'm going to flash a bunch of dots. I want you to yell out because I want you to hear what other people are yelling. Without counting, just yell out how many dots there are. Okay, ready? Go. Okay. Okay, now here's the thing so let me tell you what the numbers are. This is 16, and I heard 15 and 16. This is 8, I heard 7 and 8. This is, in fact, 32, and I heard everything. I heard 20, and I heard 70, right? And that's showing you Weber's law, right? And this is 24. Now, the other interesting fact is that if I calibrated you, if I had shown you a set of 50 and said this is 50, and then had you do that, your estimate still would have been noisier for the bigger ones, but the averages would have been 8, 16, 32, and 24. So you are actually able to estimate number using the analog magnitude system, but your estimates are increasingly noisy as the numbers get bigger. That is how the nervous system represents all kinds of continuous dimensions, including number. It's number that's being tracked here. If I had made the dots different sizes, it wouldn't have affected your estimates at all. So you're able to track number, and you have that system of representation. And so do non-human animals, and so do neonate babies. Okay? So this is how this works. Number is represented by a quantity that's linearly or logarithmically related to the cardinal value of the set. So it's like these fragments of lines are the representation of number. And I offset them like that so you can see Weber's law in length as well. It's much easier to distinguish 1 from 2 than 7 from 8, because as the things get bigger, they get noisier, right? Okay, and that's true for number representations as well. Okay, here's the second system. Infinite ordinal choice is a procedure to show it. So here you have 2 buckets. You put 1 cracker, 1 cracker, 1 cracker in one bucket. Then you put 1 cracker in the second bucket, and then the parent lets the baby crawl. And the question is, has the baby represented 3 versus 2, and do they show that by crawling to the one with more crackers? And the answer is that if it's 1 versus 2 crackers, babies reliably go to the one with more. If it's 2 versus 3, they reliably go to the one with more. But behavior falls apart at 3 versus 4. Now, that's consistent with analog magnitude representations, because I just told you that it's ratio dependent, and maybe 3 versus 4 is too fine a ratio for babies to represent. But this isn't the system of representation they're using here, because they also fail at 3 versus 6, but that's the same ratio as 1 versus 2. They also fail at 2 versus 4. And the most amazing finding is that if you put 1 cracker in here and 1, 2, 3, 4 crackers in here, they're completely at chance. Okay? Now, that's really surprising, because they're way above chance at 2 versus 3. So they can follow 5 crackers going in there. And it's just taken you 4 times as long to put the 4 crackers in as 1. I mean, all kinds of reasons you've drawn 4 times more attention to the one with 4 than 1, yet they're completely at chance. So what is going on there? Well, what's going on there is this is the system of representation they're using. What they're creating is a mental model of those crackers with one symbol in the mental model for each cracker they saw that went in there. We have this system of representation as well, just as we have the analog magnitude representation. And we, just like babies, have a very sharp limit on the number of items that we can pay attention to at once in parallel and hold in working memory. For people my age, it's 3. For babies, it's 3. For most of you, it's 4. But it's still very sharply limited. In this system of representation, there's one symbol for each individual, and there's no symbol for integers. So in this system, there are symbols for integers. Those lines are, they're meant to be instantiation of the nature of the explicit symbols in the nervous system that capture number. But here, the symbols are symbols for individuals. There's no symbol for integers or any other quantifiers, just for integers. So why am I talking about these representations? Because there are computations that are defined over those models that are numerically relevant. You can compare 2 models on the basis of one-to-one correspondence to see which one has more. There couldn't be a more numerically relevant computation. Also, the very processes that set up these representations care whether the second cracker you see is a numerically distinct individual from the first cracker you saw, because that's what the system has to know in order to open a second, to establish a second individual. So the mechanisms that set up these models guarantee that the symbols in the model stand in one-to-one correspondence with the symbols in the set. And that couldn't be more deeply numerical. So these are systems of numerical representation, but the numerical content is carried in the computations that guarantee that these things these models stand in one-to-one correspondence with the individuals. Okay, I'm going to skip this. Okay, so what I've done is just describe to you the 2 systems, and the only 2 systems that are attested in non-human animals and young babies with numerical content. And what I've tried to give you a sketch is, yes, there is innate numerical content, right? But I've also characterized what it's like. And it's nothing like integers, right? So you can say what the numerical content is when you characterize a system carefully, but that system of representation neither one can represent 7 or 100, let alone 10 to the 42nd, right? But we can. So there's the discontinuity. This is how you establish a discontinuity, is you show how some innate system of representation actually works, and you show it cannot, in principle, represent what we can, right? That's what a discontinuity is. So verbal and Arabic numerals in the count routine are discontinuous with this initial state, okay? Why can't those represent those? Well, why can't those two systems represent integers? Well, there's no symbol for integers in parallel individuation, for example, and there's an absolute size limit of 3 and 4. And why can't the ANS? It can't represent exactly 5 or exactly 15 or exactly 32. It's noisy. It can't even discriminate 15 from 16. For adults, the Weber fraction is roughly 9 to 10 or 8 to 9, whereas for babies, for neonates, it's 1 to 3, and 1 to 2 by age 6, 2 to 3 by age 9 months. And also, that system obscures the successor relation. The analog magnitude system is really built for numerical comparison and computing numerical ratios. And so it doesn't experience the difference between 9 and 10, which it can't even resolve, as the same as the difference between 1 and 2. And that is the key to the system that represents integers. Okay? So it's easy to see, once you see how those systems really work, that they are not integer representations, even though they clearly have numerical content. And the first, as I said, constructed representational system that does have the capacity to represent in numeric cultures, ontogenetically earliest, is the count routine. With verbal or Arabic numerals. This system does have explicit symbols for integers, and it implicitly represents the successor function. Okay, now the empirical consequences of this analysis is that integer representations should not be cross-culturally universal, and they aren't. And they should be very difficult for children to learn, and they are, right? The evidence for that comes from, famously in developmental psychology, this was known already in the education literature as well, is that children learn to count if they're growing up in middle-class English-speaking households shortly after their second birthday. But they don't learn what counting means for a year and a half. Okay? So they learn what 1 means. I'm going to show you how we know this in a second. And they know that the other words contrast with 1 when they're young 2-year-olds. They are in that conceptual state for 9 months before they learn what 2 means. Okay? This is the opposite of the easy cases of learning, right? They have tons of input. They know that 1 is a number and 2 is a number. They know that 2 contrasts with 1, yet they can't figure out what 2 means. Then they learn what 2 means, and they don't know what 3 means for another 3 or 4 months. Then sometime after learning 3 or 4, they figure out how counting represents number, and now they know, now for the first time, they can represent, they can represent a concept, 7, right? And that is an incredible increase in expressive power, right? Before, they can't represent any integer values above 3, even implicitly. And once they figure out how counting works, they can represent any integer that's within their count routine. Eventually, they come to the appreciation that there's no upper limit on them. So I want to just show you some evidence for this claim.
Can you give Big Bird 5 dinosaurs? And put him here.
2, 3, 4.
Yay! Can you check and make sure?
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Yay! Okay.
Matthew, can I have 3 fish? Very good. So can you count and make sure that there's 3? Can you count? Very good. You give him 4? Is that 4? Put him over here.
Wow.
Careful. Okay, can you count and make sure? Count.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5.
Oh, but you wanted 4. Can we fix it so there's 4?
It's 4.
Is that 4? Okay, good.
Could you give me 1 horse to play with? Could you put 1 horse over here for me? Thank you! Could you give me 2 of those dinosaurs and put them over here? Whoa! Look at all those dinosaurs. Could you count them? I only want 2.
Oh. 7.
Oh, but I only want 2. Good job, baby.
Okay, so the point is that kid knows how to count. She knows what 1 means. She knows 2 is different from 1. She's going to be in that state for 9 months before she becomes a 2-knower, and then I showed you a 3-knower. And then about 1.5 to 2 years later, kids figure out how counting works. So every child who knows the cardinal principles, that is how counting represents numbers, has assigned numerical meanings to 1, 2, 3, and 4 before they work that out. And no other numerals are assigned cardinal meanings before the construction of the counting principles. So 7 does not mean approximately 7 or exactly 7 or at least 7 to any subset knower. These are subset knowers are like the 1-knower and 3-knower who only know the meaning of a subset of the numerals in their count list. So how do we go from the innate initial state of ANS and parallel individuation to an understanding of counting, which actually does manage to represent number? This is a hard case, and one source of evidence that it's a hard case is that although in spite of the huge amount of input kids have, parents are surprised when they see this behavior. They know their kids can count. They think they know what counting is, what counting means. And they're really surprised when they see this behavior. So acquiring the concepts that underlie the meaning of verbal numerals is hard, and question is what makes it possible. So what we need to do is we want to characterize what the representations are like in this subset knower period. So when a child is a one knower, how are they representing one? When they're a two knower, how are they representing two? When they're a three knower, how are they representing three? Because that three knower, when he asked for three, you gave him three. He didn't do it by counting. When you asked him, when she said, can you check by counting? He said three. And then she said, can you count? And then he went 1, 2, 3. But that's not how he constructed that set, right? So what representations do underlie the meanings of 1, 2, and 3 in the subset knower period? We want to know that because that's got to be part of the input into the process by which they then figure out how counting represents number. So first, what are the representations in the subset knower period, and then how do they manage this transition to a representational system so completely different with greater expressive power than what they had before? So I'm going to give you the answers to this. I don't have time to give you the evidence for these answers, but what I believe is that the representations there's no conceptual changes that are needed in the 1, 2, 3, 4 knower. The child doesn't use any resources that aren't already in parallel individuation for this. However, they enrich it with, they enrich those representations with long-term memory models that instead of just be working memory models like sets of crackers. So what a one knower does is create a long-term memory model of a single individual. It could be a finger, your nose, your mommy, doesn't really matter. Because the way it supports the meaning of the word one is they map the word one to that model. And then they know that the answer to the question of how many is one if you're looking at a set that can be put into one-to-one correspondence with that long-term memory model. Now, we know that parallel individuation supports all those computations, but what you have to do is have the idea to make the long-term memory model that plays that computational role. But you're not doing anything that's any different from what you have innately there. And 2 is then mapped to a long-term memory of 2 individual models, and it's deployed to apply an answer to the question of how many, whenever the set you're looking at can be put into one-to-one correspondence with that long-term memory model, and similarly 3 and similarly 4. So the work of the subset knower period is building these enriched parallel individuation models. I was giving a talk and somebody raised their hand and he said, that makes sense of what my 3-year-old did for about a 4-month period. She was very interested in number. She was really trying to work out how it works. She would comment when sets were within her subset knower period. You know, when it was 2, she would say, look, 2, mommy, daddy. Look, 3, mommy, daddy, me. Every time she said 3, she said, mommy, daddy, me. And what I think is mommy, daddy, me was the long-term memory model, and anything that could be put into one-to-one correspondence with mommy, daddy, me was 3. That's exactly the representational scheme that I think she was using. Okay, so now, we've said what the innate primitives are. We've said even an intermediate step that's consistent with those innate primitives. We have the adult repertoire. The aspect of it here is just the way counting represents number. How do you make this transition? Okay, and Quinian Bootstrapping is a learning mechanism that I have shown applies in all of the conceptual discontinuities I've analyzed. So this is one simple example, but it also applies in cases of conceptual change in the history of science and conceptual changes in cases of incommensurability and in conceptual development as well. And here's how it works. You create a symbol system where the relations among the symbols are learned directly. The symbols are initially partially interpreted. They are just placeholders. And in this case, that is the count routine. So these kids, all of these kids who are in these experiments, even one-knowers, when you say, can you count my fingers? They count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That one-knower could count the dinosaurs, right? But this is completely meaningless. It's just a placeholder structure. It doesn't have any numerical content yet. It's just like patty cake, baker's man, right? I mean, they can learn all kinds of routines. But they also, meanwhile, learn the meanings of 1, 2, 3, and 4, I think, using the mechanisms by which they represent quantifiers in general, set representations of these parallel individuation models. And we know that it's parasitic on singular plural systems and things like that. That's just going on in parallel. Then they notice a suspicious coincidence. The word that you get to when you're counting 1, 2 is the word you would use in using parallel individuation to represent the number of items in that set. And that's true for 1, and that's true for 1, 2, 3. And if they're four-knowers, it's also true for 1, 2, 3, 4. Now that could just be a set of suspicious coincidences, but it is also highly it's a very big coincidence. And this might motivate them to try to figure out what the relationship is between 1, 2, 3, 4 as counting, and these meanings 1, 2, 3, 4 given by enriched parallel individuation. Okay. So I'm here. Meanwhile, the child notices the identity of the first 3 words in the count routine and the words that refer to sets of 1, 2, and 3. Okay. In trying to find a relation between them, there is, but it's a wild analogy. So this is a modeling process. The child is trying to find what is structurally similar about the numbers 1, 2, 3, and 4, and 1, 2, 3, 4, the count routine. They're both ordered, right? Numbers are ordered within parallel individuation. The set of 2 is one bigger than the set of 1. The set of 3 is 1 bigger than the set of 2. That's something that is computed by the one-to-one correspondence operations in parallel individuation. And the count routine is ordered, but the order there is next in a list. Those are totally different notions of ordering. But if the child can create analogical mappings between those two, they are in a position to make the following induction. If X is followed by Y in the count sequence, adding an individual to an X collection results in what's called a Y collection. But adding an individual is equivalent to adding 1, because that's what any single individual can be put into one-to-one correspondence with this working memory model of 1. That's it. That's the insight of how counting works. And that enables you, for the first time, to have a representation of what 5 means, and what 6 means, and what 7 means. You don't know necessarily, you don't have any non-linguistic way, count-derived way to representing exactly 5, but you do have now 5 is the set that you get when you add 1 more to a 4 set, and 6 is the set that you get when you add 1 more to a 5 set. Right? So when you have figured out this trick by modeling the numerical content with this placeholder system, you have constructed a representation that increases expressive power, because you now have 7, 8, 9, 10, as high as your count routine goes, as primitives, the computational primitives. Okay, so there's two roles for language here. One is the resources of set-based quantification in language that help establish the meaning, these enriched parallel individuation meanings for 1, 2, 3, 4. But the important one, true of all Quinian bootstrapping, is external numeral symbols. The count list provides the representational trick that's not in the core knowledge systems. It's the placeholder structure in the bootstrapping process. And when you get these new primitives, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, they're not definable in terms of the innately specified representations with numerical content. There's a new representational structure built, a count list. Now, you're not all the way to integers yet by a long time. The numerical content is still implicit, but you're a really important step there. There's many more bootstrapping episodes as you go along. So what I've illustrated here is the process by which you build placeholder structure. The relations among the symbols are learned directly. The symbols initially are partially interpreted, and the symbols serve as placeholders. And then you use the placeholder structure to model the existing representations. And that modeling process includes analogy, other modeling processes, and induction. And what this serves to do is combine and integrate separate representations from distinct, both core and otherwise enriched parallel individuation. Already goes a little bit beyond the core cognition. And what it does is it creates new computational primitives. Okay, I'm finished. I'm going to draw some conclusions, but I just want to show you something that many people who know my work know this story already, but they might not know this study. Is this something only humans can do? I thought so. But I am a colleague of Irene Pepperberg, who is the owner and trainer of Alex, who tragically died in the middle of the experiment I'm about to tell you about. But luckily for science, there was enough for it to be finished. Very sadly for Irene, because she had... Parrot owners are very close to their parrots, and they're a main relationship that you have, and she had a 40-year relationship with him. He was way too young to die as a parrot, and he's the only animal that's ever had an obituary in the New York Times. She had, over a long period of time, taught him to label set sizes. So she first taught the words 3 and 4 in the answer to questions like how many wood, when wood meant pieces of wood, how many key, and if it was 3, he said 3, and if it was 4, he said 4. And then once he'd learned that, it generalized to novel objects, and he could do it both production and comprehension. So answering to how many red, he could also answer how many red from a mixture of red, blue, and yellow sticks, right? So he could pick out the relevant set and enumerate it. I mean, it's pretty amazing already. After, that took about a year. She then taught him 2 and 5. The next 2 were, I don't know why she taught them in this order, but taught him the same way. And then 2.5 years later, she taught him 6, and that just took 2 months, okay? So at this point, he could answer, what's this? And he knew he had to give a full noun phrase. So a 3 stick, 5 wool. Or how many stick, and he must say 3. And he also could comprehend. Okay, so if you showed them this, how many key or how many cork, again, he could pick out the right set. But he also, if you said, which is 3, he would say key. Which is 2, he would say cork. Okay, so he really knew the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, then what she did was she taught him to label the Arabic numerals. So that's what he's doing here, right? And she taught him to call the yellow one 1, the purple one 4, etc. Okay. But she didn't tell him that Arabic numerals were symbol for number, right? But it was the same word. Okay. So the first question is, did he integrate the representation of Arabic numerals with his representation of number through that common word? And the way she asked that was, he had previously been taught to answer the question, say this is a blue stick and this is a green stick. Which color bigger? The answer is blue. The blue one is longer. Okay, so that was the only locution that he'd ever used which color bigger was for bigger in terms of size. And so what she did was, after he'd learned to label these numbers, she gave him a yellow Arabic numeral 4 and a blue Arabic numeral 3, for example, and asked, which color number is bigger? Which color number is smaller? He never used bigger a number to mean numerically bigger a number. And these, of course, these Arabic digits were the same physical size. But with no training, for all pairs between 1 or 6, he answered correctly. Okay? So this says that he had integrated his representation of the numerical meanings of the words 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 with these Arabic digit symbols without ever having had the Arabic digit symbols paired with number. And he knew his representation of number is now not derived, in this case, from a list, because he was never taught the list, but it's derived from the intrinsic ordering of the numerals, right? Okay, so at this point, he knows that numbers are ordered between 1 and 6, and he knows words for 1 and 6. And we could then ask, can he do the same bootstrapping kids can do? Because we could teach him words for Arabic numerals 7 and 8. So he can't say 7, so we said it's Sinan. And we also taught him to do 6 CC, because we didn't want the only 2-digit word. It was C before, and now it's CC. So we taught him to call 6 CC, 7 Sinan, and 8 8. This is just labeling the Arabic digits. Now, this is very boring for him. It took him a year to learn, and it's hard to say these, to learn to say, he's a parrot. But he did learn to do it, and it was to a criterion that a listener could identify what he was saying 100% of the time without knowing what numeral he was looking at, right? And he was actually saying the right one, all right? So that took more than a year. He reached that criterion. Okay, then we taught him, but we hadn't so far, except for the fact that 6 was in there. There was lots of other things he was labeling too. There was no direct evidence that 7 and 8 were numerals. They're just shapes that he's labeling. But then we taught him using the which number bigger locution. 6 is smaller than 7. 6 is smaller than 8. 7 is smaller than 8. 8 is bigger than 7. 8 is bigger than 6. 7 is bigger than 6. So we just gave them pairs, which color number bigger. And of course, he didn't know the answer to start with, but we gave him feedback. This only took a week. It was very easy for him to learn this order. Okay, so now here's what he knows. He knows what 1 through 6 are, and that those numbers are ordered. And now he knows that 6 is less than 7, and 7 is less than 8. Now this is consistent with 7 being 100 and 8 being 1,000,000. I mean, it's consistent with lots of numbers. But he had never, ever been taught before a new number without it being one different from ones that he was taught. Remember, he was taught 3 and 4, then 2 and 5, then 6. I guess 1 and 6. He was taught in this third thing. So always the numbers he taught differed by 1. So it's not a warrant induction, but it's not a crazy induction. So the question is, did he induce that 7 means exactly 7 and 8 means exactly 8 from this? That's the same induction that kids make at this transition, okay? So the way we tested that was we showed him sets of 7 and 8, a few trials of small sets, 1 to 6. He was 100% correct on those. Okay, the first time we showed him a set of 7, we asked how many. He said, see none. First time we showed him a set of 8, he said, see none. Oops, 8. He didn't say oops, but he said, see none, 8, right? And then the next, he self-corrected to 8, and the next trials mixed together were 100% correct, okay? So he had induced from their place in the ordered list what cardinal value, that's exactly the same induction that children make. So he only got 1 trial a day. It was mixed in with lots of other things he was doing. I mean, there's nothing cueing him that this is about number. And for sets of 7, he was 7 out of 12 trials correct. He wasn't perfect at this in labeling it. And for sets of 8, 9 out of 12, that's highly different than chance if you assume chance is a third. If you assume chance is an eighth, because he knows 8 numbers, that's even wildly more. But since we're really concentrating on 6, 7, and 8, I think that's correct. But in comprehension, we showed him sets, 2 or 3 sets mixed together. These are big sets, right? So a set of 7 something, a set of 8 something, and a set of 10 something all mixed together, and said, what color 7, okay? He was 7 out of 7 correct for 7, and 4 out of 5 correct for 8. Then he died. So it's, I mean, I'm really sorry he died, because he was a very important bird in science. And because I'm friends with Irene and she was devastated. But I'm very glad that there was this much data before he died, because all of this is statistically significant. So the conclusions for Alex. He induced the cardinal meaning for 7 and see none and 8, 8 from knowledge of the meanings of 1 through 6, plus the information that 6 is smaller than 7, 7, and 7 is smaller than 8. That's exactly the same induction kids are making. This is not hypothesis testing, and it's not enumerative induction. He was never corrected. He never, ever was shown the right answer. He was never told the right answer. He was never given a pair of 7, a labeled pair of 7 with 7. And he wasn't, if he made a mistake, he wasn't corrected. There was no error correction, and the input never involved the pairing between 7 and sets of 7 or 8 and sets of 8. Okay, so how does bootstrapping work? It creates new primitives by creating new data structures of blank predicates in terms of available combinatorial resources. Here, the ordered external symbols. It uses these to model phenomena already represented. Here, sets cardinal values in terms of enriched parallel individuation. Okay, so my conclusions. Meeting FODOR'S challenges. You can learn computational primitives. Computational primitives are not all innate primitives. And learning proceeds sometimes not by logical construction from existing primitives. So what are the implications of this for a theory of concepts? Well, the main take-home lesson I want you to get from this is the importance of conceptual role in determining content. So in the easy cases, what there are is an innate conceptual role. Okay, the indigos, buntings innately knew what to do with a representation of north in the night sky. I mean, the content of that it's north, is that they set their, it's exhausted by setting your navigational behavior with respect to it. That's innate. What had to be learned was how to identify north in the night sky. So there's innate conceptual role, and then there are innate learning mechanisms to create the computational primitives to fulfill that role. Whenever that happens, it's when you get one trial learning, very easy learning. And that's all over the place in our conceptual development. But it's not it's still creating a new primitive. And the hard cases, You co-construct conceptual role and the primitives to play that role. But you can't have a theory of concepts without making conceptual role one of the central parts of it. Okay, so what I've done is illustrate how you get from the baby to an adult, and along the way attempted to answer FODOR'S 2 challenges to cognitive science.